Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Jenny Gentles, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C.
This is a very dangerous intervention that schools are grossly unqualified to be doing, but it's really solidifying this false identity in the child's mind.
President Trump has promised that his administration will get transgender insanity the hell out of our schools. While campaigning, he said his education department would impose severe consequences if schools suggest to a child that they could be trapped in the wrong body. Those consequences could include the loss of federal funding. Florida mother January Littlejohn joins us today to shine the light on the pernicious policies schools have embraced in order to advance gender ideology. We touch on January's family story. After her daughter was secretly transitioned at her middle school, the family removed her from the school and sued the school district for violating their parental rights. But we focus on the impact of social transition on children, why it's so critical for parents to be vigilant, the dangers of this growing trend in schools, and how policymakers and families can protect their children from harmful ideologies. January, welcome to Freedom to Learn. I'm so happy that we're having this conversation here today.
It's great to be with you, Jenny.
You're a mother of 3 school-aged children. Your daughter was socially transitioned at her middle school in 2020 without your knowledge or consent. How's she doing now?
Well, thank you for that question. I'm fiercely protective over her privacy. This has been really, really hard. It's challenging being a teenager in today's time in general. But then to have your personal life thrust into public in the way that we've done, because my husband and I felt very strongly that we had to speak out. We had to warn other families about what was happening. But thankfully, we have been able to fight so hard because our daughter did come through the confusion. About 2.5 years into the confusion, she desisted, which means she no longer experiences any kind of distress over her sex. But, I warn parents that there is still a core issue that led to that vulnerability or led to the distress. And so parents have to be vigilant and understand that even when your child desists or walks away from the trans identification, they may still have other issues that are unresolved and need to be resolved. But she is a senior in high school now. This happened when she was in the 7th and 8th grade. And so it's wonderful to see her being a normal adolescent, because this ideology robs these children of time that they're never going to get back. And she still grieves the time that our family was just turned upside down, where she wasn't experiencing normal adolescent milestones.
I appreciate you sharing that message of hope for families who might be walking through this right now, and that message of clarity that there are these children who get drawn into this idea of a new gender identity and do undergo social transition within the family or without, and that was outside the family for you all. But that doesn't mean it's a permanent state. Let's back up a little bit and talk about what social transition is. How would you define that?
I want to be very clear that social transition, this is not just about names and pronouns. And I have spoken with hundreds of families in the last 4 years who have experienced some level of this violation in the school. And it's not a benign intervention. It is a psychotherapeutic intervention where they are affirming any identity the child brings to them. So in the case with our daughter, they would have called her Pinocchio if that's what she wanted to be called. There is no discernment. There is no differential diagnosis happening. It is only affirming anything the child says. And when you really think about that we're affirming anything that an 11, a 12, or 13-year-old is saying, that is insane on its face, because we know from decades of brain development that children don't have the cognitive maturity to weigh these kind of decisions. And the reason why social affirmation is so dangerous is because it's the first step toward medical intervention. And when you pull back the layer and the curtain of this so-called gender affirming care that they're doing under the guise of evidence-based healthcare, it is not evidence-based at all. And I would argue that it's not even healthcare. They are taking healthy children and putting them into a disease state with off-label use puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and even surgical interventions done on girls as young as 12 years old in our country. So this is a very dangerous intervention that schools are grossly unqualified to be doing, but it's really solidifying this false identity in the child's mind, and it makes them less likely to come to terms with their natal bodies, which is what we want. We don't want children living in a delusional state about their bodies, just as we wouldn't want that for a child experiencing an eating disorder. And so this is a psychiatric issue that we should be treating with psychotherapy, not invasive, radical, irreversible physical alterations to one's body. And I say psychotherapy, but parents know in this realm that you have to be very careful with who you hire to help you navigate this with your child. Because unfortunately, just as this ideology has infiltrated every aspect of our culture, including our medical field, just look at the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines when it comes to this. They are completely an outlier in how they are treating this type of distress compared to other European countries who are following the evidence. They are following the systematic reviews like the CAST review. You have to be careful because unfortunately this ideology has infiltrated my profession of counseling as well. And we're seeing it run rampant, not just in the schools, but in the school counseling field, the psychological counseling field, psychiatry, and even our medical schools.
Well, I believe I've quoted you when I've said that social transition is not a neutral act. Like, this is leading kids down a very particular path. It's also trapping kids who don't have natural social skills. It's backing them into a corner where they've said they have this identity. They want this new name. They want these new pronouns. They want these new accommodations. And then when they do start desisting for whatever reason, they're kind of backed into this corner because the school is so all in and so enthusiastic, and they don't know how to navigate their way back out. So you're trapping a kid who likely has ADHD, autism spectrum, depression, anxiety, other challenges that makes navigating life hard for them. You're making it really hard for them to have this temporary state of embracing a gender identity and then coming out on the other side of it at school. So the schools just need to back off when it comes to social transitions. You mentioned you've talked to a lot of families. Where are these families from that you're interacting with?
Well, they're from all over the country. I mean, I speak to parents in California, Oregon, which is very difficult when it comes to this issue because not only, are their parental rights being violated left and right in the schools, but they also have the fear of Child Protective Services getting involved and actually accusing them of emotional abuse or neglect if they don't affirm the lie of a trans identity. And so you have cases where parents are extremely worried. They know that their child's distress may be related to former sexual abuse or other types of trauma the child has experienced, and they're trying to protect their child from medical harm that's occurring. Let's be clear, we are talking about sterilizing vulnerable children, taking away their future sexual functioning by using these off-label drugs. There is no evidence to back this, and the risks far outweigh the benefits. But I want to touch on something that you just said about the schools. It's because it's really, really important. Kids need to be able to save face. And oftentimes, parents, once the school affirms, because you're right, they get an incredible amount of affirmation, attention, encouragement, praise, not just from their peers, but also from the adults in their lives. And that's a power differential in itself. Oftentimes, parents have to pull their children from schools. And that is something, I was unprepared to do. My husband and I are both products of public school. We loved public school. I was even a substitute teacher in my district. I firmly believed that the school was a partner in teaching and educating our child, not raising my child, not giving my child mental health interventions, but teaching my child. And so parents have to understand, in order to fully give their child a chance to desist, oftentimes it takes full removal from any environment or institution where that child is being affirmed in the false identity. Because it's very difficult for a child to then go back to their teachers, go back to their peers and say, I'm just a girl, I realize, so I'm going to go back to my birth name and pronouns. We have abdicated our role as parents, and that is one of the biggest issues when trying to get your child out of this, is if a parent is not willing to go to bat for their child and actually be the parent and have these uncomfortable conversations, be uncomfortable in the role where your child may hate you for an extended period of time, it is going to be very hard to get your child out of it. But we even told our daughter, throw me under the bus. Tell them that this is a requirement of you going back to school, that you have to go by your birth name and pronouns. We will take that heat. You don't have to, because it's hard enough for them to come out of this identity. It's almost like this false promise for these girls that everything that they hated about themselves will somehow disappear if they create someone new. They are trying to escape something. And parents, you are the expert of your child. You cannot outsource this issue to a therapist, even a very trained, good therapist that won't affirm the false identity. They may help your child with coping skills and increase their self-esteem and social skills. But parents, you are the expert. You intuitively know your child better than anyone else. And often the hard work falls on you to parent your child through this confusion.
I hear you saying that for parents encountering this, that sometimes, and maybe all the times, they're going to need to pull their child out of that school environment that is aggressively affirming something that is not biologically true and is harming the child. They need to be really careful when they're selecting therapists who can help their children with their underlying emotional issues. You took the course of action, your husband and you, to file a federal lawsuit against the school district for parental rights violations. Not every parent is going to take that action. What else would you recommend that the parents do?
You need to be the parent that your child needs you to be. And so you have to set appropriate, healthy boundaries for your child. And what that looked like for our family is, while the child is getting through whatever they're experiencing, if they're asking for something that's going to harm them psychologically or physically, the answer has to be no, because my number one job as a parent is to keep my child safe first and foremost. But if it's not going to harm them psychologically or physically, then the answer is yes. So what that looked like for us is, you wear what you want, you express yourself with clothing how you want, but breast binders, puberty blockers, even the name and pronouns, that can cause harm. Because again, even the social affirmation leads to the medical interventions, which we know that children cannot give informed consent to. And often, this is being painted as a parental rights issue, like parents should have the right to choose which treatment. But parents do not have the right to medically abuse their child or consent to the medical abuse of their child, because this is all based on self-ID. There is no test to determine whether a child is going to persist in their dysphoria or desist. And the best research we have tells us, if you don't socially or medically transition a child, statistically, they will resolve their distress once they go through natural puberty. So this notion that we're giving children an option out of puberty, which is the actual natural remedy to this type of distress, is just completely backwards from what we should be doing.
The other thing that I would add is smartphones, which we know across the board are harmful to kids, particularly to emotionally vulnerable young women. Don't let them have the smartphones. There are still flip phones, and it's quite possible for a child to survive puberty and in fact thrive with a flip phone, not a smartphone.
And the research is showing that no social media under the age of 18 for teens. It is not good for them. We were in the first generation of social media, which was Facebook. It was a way to reconnect with people that we hadn't seen and get a glimpse into their lives through photos and things of that nature. Our kids are faced with TikTok, and it's a game changer. It's addictive. It feeds them algorithms that, they just continue to feed these children things that they're spending more time on. And oftentimes it is not healthy topics. You talk about self-esteem issues that can rapidly deteriorate into anxiety, depression, and even self-harm. This ideology infiltrated the schools, even here in Florida, under the guise of anti-bullying and non-discrimination policies. It really wasn't until this happened to our family that I even knew what was happening. And thankfully, here in Florida, this was back in 2020, our legislature acted quickly and passed the Parent Bill of Rights. They passed the Parental Rights and Education Law to try to prevent these types of parental violations from happening. But you have to understand that laws are not enough. So this ideology has really infiltrated everywhere, and you've got to teach your children very clear messages about what conversations are safe to have outside of the home and what conversations aren't. And then we also have to be reaffirming them that sex is real, it cannot be changed, and we can and should have compassion for those who are confused and believing the lie of gender identity ideology, but we do not affirm people in a lie.
What's going on in K-12 schools that is fostering the social transitions?
There are multiple facets to this gender ideology monster. You know, we've got the boys and girls spaces, boys and girls sports, and those are kind of low-hanging fruit that people can see, and they have a visceral reaction because it's so grossly unfair to see a man beating a woman, literally. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to schools, it's not just the gay straight alliance clubs. It's not just the rainbow clubs. And it varies from state to state, by the way. In some states, this ideology has become embedded into every subject from K through 12. So you'll have innocuous math questions asking questions like, there are 5 boys, 2 girls, and 3 non-binary students. How many students are there altogether? So right there, you know, this notion that we can be non-binary, that is a lie in itself. And so kids are being introduced to this ideology in a variety of ways. Even a teacher asking for preferred names and pronouns at the start of the year on an index card. That should not be happening. We've got social emotional learning where this is being taught through. We've got sexual education programs where this is being taught. You see bulletin boards where they have all these made up gender identities being taught to children. So it's really a systemic issue. And if your school district uses words like inclusivity, we are an inclusive, safe school, you better believe that those children are being taught the lies of gender identity ideology. You've got books starting from toddlerhood that are telling children, you know, like bye-bye binary is one of them. Doctors make a guess as your gender at birth, and sometimes they guess wrong. I mean, this is just insanity. The whole notion that you pick your pronouns like you're picking a pair of tennis shoes, that is not true. And it all comes down to the false idea that you can have a mismatch in your brain and your sexual biology, and that we have this internal sense of gender. It is all a lie.
Where's the lie coming from? Like, what's the source of it? Why is it showing up in schools?
Essentially, in 2015, when gay marriage was legalized, all of that activism flipped to trans rights, specifically trans youth rights. So it's being painted as a human rights issue, and it's all stemming from queer theory, where they're trying to basically blow up the idea of sex. They're portraying sex as a spectrum. That is just not biologically true. Parents need to understand that this lie is being infiltrated, even in our children's programming. You know, we've seen it in the Blue's Clues and Disney program. It's everywhere. And I'm convinced that the only way to truly win this war that's been waged against our children and reality itself is to fully inoculate them with the truth. So when they hear the lies, they know that they're lies.
I found it helpful in conversations with you in recent years to understand the role of nonprofits, of NGOs in this. I believe you were able to trace some of the things that were happening in Florida to a group called Equality Florida. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Equality Florida, and you can go in other states, you know, there's an Equality Utah, and I'm sure there's many other versions of this type of advocacy network in every state. But starting in 2016, they created what was called a Safe Schools program within Equality Florida. And their sole mission was to, quote unquote, partner with schools all over Florida under the guise of non-discrimination and anti-bullying. So they would approach these schools and say, how are you best treating your LGBTQ students? They would throw around the suicide lie. They would tell teachers and administration that these children are much likely to be homeless or abused by parents. So they were unilaterally painting all parents to be a danger to just these children, by the way, because in every other circumstance, parents are necessary. We know that the best positive student outcomes are when parents are involved. And so it was just such a lie on its face. And it's so hard for me to understand why there wasn't more pushback at the time from teachers who know these parents, know that parents are not inherently a danger to their children.
Who understand how emotionally vulnerable kids struggle as they hit puberty or struggle as they hit these different stages of development and can go off the rails in a number of different directions. To understand how highly sensitive girls are very uncomfortable in their body, particularly when they hit puberty. Like, these educators knew that. Certainly the counselors knew that. Yeah, why were they silent?
That's exactly right. And why were they silent when they started seeing these quote unquote gender support plans, which is what they did with my daughter? You know, these plans are not just about name and pronouns. They are asking these children questions that would absolutely impact their safety, like which restroom and locker room do you prefer to use? Which sex do you prefer to room with on overnight field trips? And then they ask the child, how should we refer to you when speaking to your parents? Should we use your chosen name, or should we use your birth name so that your parents don't even know these social transitions have occurred? And I've spoken to parents that have been kept in the dark in this manner, and it has been catastrophic. There was a 12-year-old girl in Clay County in Florida who attempted suicide on school grounds because the stress of living a double life was too much for her to bear. And so, you know, that's one of the biggest reasons my husband and I went public with what was happening. Again, we had to warn other parents because I was very concerned about, you know, not only did I live it, not only did I see the wedge that was placed between us and our child, it created a huge amount of turmoil and conflict at home. And it caused our daughter to completely deteriorate mentally. And so Equality Florida, not only did they partner with these schools, but they put these guides in schools. And this was very nefarious because they were called guides for a very specific reason. If it's an actual policy, it has to go through school board approval. But a guide can be treated like a de facto policy, but it does not have to go through school board approval. And so these guides were very explicit in painting parents to be the enemy to their children. It even said in the Leon County Guide, which thankfully has been rescinded, that outing a child when it comes to their gender identity to a parent could cause abuse or make them homeless.
Not just Equality Florida that's out there. There's GLSEN.
Human Rights Campaign. There's GLAAD. I mean, there's so many players that contributed to this lie. You know, GLAAD actually helped ensure that the media will use wrong sex pronouns, making them repeat the lie. So you see like Banana's story saying woman rapes other woman with her penis. No, that's not accurate. And it gets very confusing to the reader when they start, you know, going off on these lies that are just blatant lies, not using sex-based pronouns.
Right. So you have AP style guides, you have all kinds of policing of language in very nefarious ways. You also have a very aggressive cut and paste thing that happens at the school districts when you have something like a gender support plan or policies that lead to that secretive gender support plan that absolutely drives a wedge between an emotionally vulnerable child and their parents. The Parents Defending Education has gone through a number of different school board policies and has found over 1,000 examples from school districts, over 1,000 school districts across the country, impacting over 10 million students who attend those schools, have these policies in place that say when a child comes to you and expresses confusion about their body or their gender, then immediately switch into action and create this gender support plan. Make sure you're creating that without the parents' involvement, and make sure you're hiding the information from the parents if the child says that that's what they want.
And these kids have co-occurring psychiatric issues. You are hiding a psychiatric issue from parents who are the ones that are ultimately responsible for the mental health and physical well-being of that child, not the school. When we pulled our daughter from school, do you think teachers and the school counselor and the assistant principal and the social worker I had never met checked to see how my daughter was doing? Absolutely not. We never heard from them again.
It's an act, right? What about those poor, quote unquote, trans kids? We care about them so much. This is where they'll be safe and included and loved until they leave, and then we'll never think about them again.
It's fake compassion. It's completely fabricated.
And then also the act that they know that child, and therefore it makes sense to walk through this gender support plan process and through this social transition. If you're talking about a child who has just started 6th grade in middle school, and the school counselor at this likely large school, the teacher who maybe has that child for a small fraction of the day, maybe even for a fraction of the year, this child is not known. So that act as if they know the child, they know the child's history, they know the child's struggles, is completely just that. It's an act, and it needs to stop.
And if you go to the American School Counselor Association and look at their policy where they are training their school counselors, who, by the way, are in almost every school in the United States now. We've got more mental health counselors and more school counselors available today than we ever had in history. But they are training these school counselors to not only keep the gender transition plan secret from parents, but to hide them in their offices. They are being trained to hide the gender support plans because, according to FERPA, you can't keep school records from parents because there are children, right? But when you ask for the cumulative record, oftentimes those gender support plans are not a part of that cumulative record. So parents do not even know this has happened.
That's a violation of FERPA. It all qualifies under FERPA as an educational record, and you may not hide any of it from parents. So they're violating federal law.
Yes, that's exactly right.
You've talked a bit about the training, and that's not just for the school counselors, but the teachers must be receiving similar training in their professional development that then is influenced by the outside groups and through their education schools. Do you have recommendations for what can be done at the federal level to address these issues?
I would love to see any kind of federal funding be withdrawn from schools pushing this ideology. If you're going to hide this from parents, you don't get federal money, period. End of story. I would also like to see the made-up term of gender identity taken out of every law on the books. We are codifying something into law that can't be quantified or even clearly defined. That does not make sense to protect something that we can't define as a protected class. And I'm hoping the Supreme Court Scrivener case is going to make the right determination and side with the state of Tennessee, that states do have the right to ban these medical interventions. However, what about the blue states? I get parents contacting me desperate, and not all of them can move. Many of them have, by the way. There are families fleeing California, Oregon, Colorado, and Washington because they are very concerned about their children being taken from them if they don't affirm this lie. We have to approach this at multiple different ways. Yes, laws, yes, federally, but we have to change the culture too, Jenny. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think when this house of cards falls, it's going to fall hard. The bottom line is this is a social contagion. We are manufacturing confusion through the teaching of this pseudoscientific ideology because we did not have this issue 20 years ago. It was non-existent. So we have got to change the culture in addition to changing the laws and other things that we can be doing with this new administration. I'm very hopeful.
Congressman Tim Walberg of Michigan introduced the Protect Kids Act and made sure that it made it through committee. It also made it through the full House as part of the Parents' Bill of Rights that passed in 2023. And that Protect Kids Act does pull federal funding from schools that hide information about a child's social transition from parents. So Senator Tim Scott introduced a similar bill in the Senate. So you do have support on both sides. It's not law, but you have an incoming leader of the House Education and Workforce Committee who's aware of this issue and has actually been working to pass legislation. And I think that we can probably see more coming out of that committee and hopefully out of the House.
Would also love to see the statute of limitations as to when someone can sue extended. I think the lawsuits from a monetary standpoint is going to end this much quicker than anything else. Lawsuits take time. Chloe Cole's lawsuit is still ongoing, and even our own parental rights violation lawsuit we filed in October of 2021. It was dismissed by the federal judge in December of 2022, and now we are appealing that judge's decision to the 11th Circuit, and we're still awaiting their decision. So these things take years, and in the meantime, families are literally being destroyed by this ideology. Destroyed. It is heartbreaking. And this is one reason, even though my child is in a better place, I can't walk away from this. There are parents that contact me every week, waking up to the same nightmare that we experienced in 2020.
We're going to hear a lot of activists and activist-trained educators lament the harm to quote-unquote trans kids if adults affirm biological reality. What are your top 3 responses that you'd recommend saying?
The first is what's harmful is affirming a child in the lie that they can be born wrong. What's harmful is placing a child on an irreversible medical pathway, knowing full well that child does not have the ability to weigh these decisions 10, 20, 30 years down the road, how they're going to feel about giving up their fertility, their sexual functioning, and all kinds of complications medically that come along with these medical interventions. And I think finally, what's harmful is putting a physically healthy child into a state of disease and cutting off healthy body parts and thinking that is going to fix a psychiatric issue.
How can people follow your work?
I'm on X. That's one way just to kind of get information and things that I put out there at January Do No Harm. I'm also a senior fellow at Do No Harm, so you can reach out to me through that way. You can fill out an inquiry on the donoharmmedicine.org page. And then also parents can follow our new stoptheharmdatabase.com so that they know which hospitals and which doctors are actually performing these irreversible medical interventions on minors. And they can steer clear of those doctors and hospitals because we really shouldn't put our trust and faith into any institution that is willing to cut the healthy body parts off of children.
January, thank you for your commitment to protecting emotionally vulnerable children and young people and for defending parental rights. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for all you are doing, and it's great to be with you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.